Hey, the bathroom just called. They need reinforcements, so I'm gonna go drop some drop pods.
That's so gross. Why do you have wipes?
I like things moist. You know what they say. If it's wetter, it's better.
Getting something wet does not make everything better.
You use wipes to paint. You make that wet.
Are you talking about my wet palette? Yeah, wet palettes are nice, but they don't make everything better.
Look, do whatever you want, but I like to keep things moist.
You are the worst. One of the more difficult things to the tabletop gaming hobby is finding out what skills, what tools, what things work best for you. And I learned something this week that just kind of blew my mind. And it has to do with the wet palette. Anyone who's in this hobby, anyone who's been into painting miniatures for any amount of time generally knows what a wet palette is, and it's something that I feel like gets pushed pretty hard. Hey, back when I first started this channel, it was one of the first things that I pushed because of what I had been told about it and my experiences with it. But I have come to learn the truth, and that's what I want to share with you today. Now, when I say I learned the truth, what I mean is simply this. When I was first getting into 3D printing and painting, wet palettes were pushed as a way to keep your paints wet so that you could use them a week later, or a few days later. And I thought, that's incredible, because I only have like 30 minutes a night to paint. And so if I can keep my paint in here and keep it nice and moist, then I would be able to, paint without any problems. And that's the problem. As much as they want to push that wet palettes are meant to keep your paint moist, and they might a little bit, but you have to keep adding water. You have to keep going back to them. And when you do that, the simple truth is that the paint colors that you put in there last night are no longer the same color that they were. I have been watching multiple YouTube channels, with Squidmar, where he talked about wet palettes and how wet palettes, they don't keep things moist, especially where he lives, and granted, it changes depending on where you live, but it doesn't keep the paint wet. You have to reactivate it. You have to do different things to the paint to get it to come back. And in the end, it's not going to be the same color, because if you have to add more water to it, it's going to be a thinner runnier paint. And then I was listening to Trapped Under Plastic, the podcast that Ninjon and Miniac do, which if you haven't listened to, you should. It's fantastic. And they were interviewing the guy who started Monument Hobbies and their painting line. And it was so funny because they started to give him crap for not using a wet palette. And I don't think I'll ever forget his response, because he came back and he was just like, there's no reason to use a wet palette.
Feel any different? I don't feel like the wet palette doesn't do me any good.
And now he did go on to mention that there were certain uses that it has, and that he just didn't like it with his painting styles. And granted, he's a Golden Demon winner. I mean, this guy is a well-known painter, and he knows his stuff. So why do people keep using them? So let's start with the misconceptions that I had with a wet palette when I bought it. I thought it was going to keep all my colors great and everything. And keep in mind, you can use the colors a week later if you're keeping it nice and wet and everything, but the colors change. They fade over time. If you're looking at this image that I pulled up right now, this is the paints after 2 days. They harden up. Can you reactivate them? Yes, but like I said, they're not the same that they were before. Metallics just separate, because from what I understand, metallics are just, flecks of metal and things like that held in with some medium. And so when they sit in a wet palette, they just separate. From what I understand, they separate anywhere you put them, but a wet palette is where you're going to see it the most. And as always, I mean, if you forget to add water to this thing, with time, it just evaporates and it's going to dry out anyway. And so you got to kind of babysit it. You have to watch it. You have to make sure you're adding water to it. And they can be really expensive. Granted, mine's just one of the cheaper models that I found on Amazon for like 12 bucks, but I've been using it for a solid year now. One other thing to keep in mind, because water is underneath the paints and the paints slowly absorb that water all the time, they start to run. And if your wet palette is on any kind of an angle, your paints are just going to run all over the place. Even if they started out thick, just because of how a wet palette works, it's going to start to move. So just kind of keep those things in mind. You know, I'm happy that I have a wet palette. I wouldn't change things because I've learned to paint with a wet palette. But just like the guy at Monument Hobby said, it's not necessary. You know, if your paints are too thick, add some medium to them and thin them out. And then what do you have? You just have a little bit more of a thinner paint. And just use it. You should never be putting down so much paint that you have to, which is why it's nice to find a paint that lets you put down a couple drops or a drop at a time. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, I'm an idiot because every major painter out there that you know is using a wet palette, so why wouldn't you? And I guess kind of what I've come to realize with the wet palettes, and like I said, I wouldn't get rid of mine. I like mine. I've learned to paint with it. And there's something that you learn to do with the wet palette because it thins down your paints. And that is that you learn to paint, obviously with thinner paints, but to also glaze. A wet palette is like the #1 tool when it comes to glazing because it allows you to thin your paints out right there on the palette. You just grab a little bit of that paint, you drag it over that wet surface, and you get your perfect glaze. You don't have to add anything, you don't have to do anything else. And so those artists, those famous artists that are doing those perfect, amazing glazes, the wet palette is super helpful to get there. I don't do a ton of glazing, you know, I'm learning how to do these processes, but I know that it's easier. It's something that even me as a novice painter, when I use the wet palette, I know that it makes glazing easier. And so I don't want you to think that they're bad, because wet palettes aren't. But I also don't want you to think that it's going to be this magic tool that keeps your paints wet for forever and that you can use it whenever you want. There are benefits to having a wet palette. And yeah, you can keep paints longer than any other way. But keep in mind, you're probably going to have to add water to them, and they are going to change. So every time you paint with a wet palette, you're painting with a little bit different paint than you used last time. For most of us, that's not a big deal. You know, for me, it's not a big deal. I'm not professional yet. You know, but one day I hope to, and then I hope that I'm using that paint, and when I'm done, I move on and I get a new piece of parchment paper to put down and start over on my wet palette instead of keeping those paints that I don't need to paint. It's always better to try and paint as much as you can in one sitting, but let's be honest, with this hobby, that doesn't happen very often. So, the truth about wet palettes are, they're a nice tool, but they're not a necessary one. They're not even one that I think you have to get to start painting. I think you're better off getting some decent paints, getting a decent brush, and then getting some medium if you need to thin them out a little bit. And that's all you need to start. And it doesn't even need to be like nice stuff. You spend 20, 30 bucks on a couple paints and a couple brushes and start. That's the best thing about this hobby, is that you get in what you get out of it, exactly what you put into it. And if you put in a lot of time, I promise you're going to get something great at the end. So keep trying. Use that wet palette, use that dry palette, use whatever you have at your disposal, and you can make it work. I promise. Thanks for joining us today at Pulsegate as we talk about the truth behind the wet palette. And if you like content like this and you want to stick around and see us paint, see us create things, right now I'm in the process of 3D printing an entire village. I just finished my Barbie house that you see here, and the town is just going to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. We're going to paint it. We're going to talk about everything that comes with making a board for D&D or for any tabletop war game out there. So stick around, like, subscribe, join the channel, help us grow a little bit. And I promise it will help your experience get a little bit better. So thank you for your time, and for joining us here at Polskate. And as always, don't spend so much time building your world that you forget to spend some time in it. Till next time.